Hi, my name is Maria Early. This is my presentation on Condoleezza Rice as a character-driven leader. Rice was the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State under the W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, and she really was a leader in a very divisive time, both in the public sector and the diplomatic subsector, as well as later on and currently in the private and academic subsectors. Working with as a professor and with a couple different schools, most notably Stanford. But the time that she was involved in the public sector specifically is what I'm going to be looking at the most. And it was a very divisive time after 9/11 because of the war on terror and the way that that pulled the United States between trending towards isolationism and in a seeking to defend itself, as well as global action and to the point of being invasive. And so she was very torn between these two emotions at home on the American front and had to straddle what is necessary and the balance between the two when we get involved in the Middle East and taking measures at home. It was turbulent between the military and the State Department in deciding who was responsible for what. And as the Secretary of State, she was tasked with working with the military to find mutually cooperative actions that they could take for the benefit of the entire country. There was a lot of change going on with the reorganization of departments, such as the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and its newfound role as it was navigating that during the first decade of the 2000s. And there was also a lot of economic cuts and things going on prior to the 2008 recession that required a lot of newfound ways to be efficient in the State Department. The internet boom happened at the same time, so that could be both a tool and a downfall to the government and to leaders, depending on how they used it. And a lot of new actors were involved in this era as well after the Cold War, when all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of newly independent countries in the Eastern Bloc area that need to have some kind of arrangement for what's going to happen with the nuclear resources of Russia and their capabilities in the region. She was very grounded by a lot of personal values. She believed firmly in reaching across the aisle domestically in politics, as well as reaching out to other countries around the world that we have not typically aligned ourselves with to find common ground on issues such as nuclear management, democratic reform, working on human trafficking, and such. So, cooperation was a very core tenet for her. And democracy was something you'll hear her talk about over and over again every time you hear her speak. The idea that we as Americans pick democracy as our championing value, but it's a universal concept that benefits everybody the more places that it's implemented and the more ways that it's implemented. So that was something she really took to heart with her concept of transformational diplomacy. In her memoir, she said it was her greatest honor to serve her country, and that really struck to her heart, as well as education, something that she wanted to broaden for everybody because that opened up a lot of doors for her. And she sees that as more of an empowerment and a strengthening of democracy when people are educated and able to choose for themselves what they're going to do knowingly. She also believed in taking responsibility for our problems. When we see something, we need to be able to take responsibility for the portions of it in which we are able to affect change. Gender equality was a big issue that was close to her heart when she got involved with the Ban Bossy campaign to help change the narrative around girls and women in leadership, as well as was involved in reforming and changing the way that gender integrated training occurs in the military to benefit both men and women. And her faith was a constant touchstone for her in the face of adversity and a lot of conflict throughout her career. She could always return home and find that inner strength through her religion. When it came to ethical decision making and leadership, she seemed to follow a very typical structure as she approached problem solving that tied in responsibility with positional duty. So she would look at what she is capable of individually and personally, what is required of her position, what her duty is, and together between the two, find the capacity for different options going forward, choose one action and take it that would have a positive and most overwhelming impact on those around her. And she takes that, what that looks like in application would help her become a very ethical leader over time. And it encouraged her to take a very roots-based analysis to problem sets. For example, in the post 9/11 world, counterterrorism that she was tasked with, she looked at it and saw it as counter extremism, and that helped her make a lot of ethical decisions and avoid a lot of unintended consequences along the way. She was known to be very self-controlled in communicating with people. She would listen before she spoke, so she would go in with the most knowledge and understanding of a situation without acting emotionally or irrationally. And by applying this same concept of decision making as an ethical leader, she could prioritize things and be consistent in her prioritization. She also was very ethical in that she empowered others to make good decisions the same way that she did. She did not strive to have all the power to make decisions for others, but as someone who championed democracy and valued it, she realized that that is empowering other people and actually acting on that. And in fact, it was a moral imperative for her. She had to do it, it wasn't just an option. And she also embodied and showed that systems, especially in a democracy, have to stand beyond the individual people. They cannot rely on one person. That's authoritarianism. And so, just like George Washington stepped out of office once he realized his time was up, she stepped out of the public sphere and turned to the academic sphere and embodied that as an example to those around her, how to step out of the spotlight and trust that the work you've done is enough. Her leadership style was very centrist. She worked on a lot of bipartisan committees and broke party lines time and time again very publicly. But whatever team she was on, bipartisan, partisan, international, she built a shared identity based on what the mission was for that group of people and was a very good team builder. Reaching across the aisle to build bridges, and her most notable one was when she got 6 different countries with a lot of different perspectives, Japan, China, Russia, the United States, and North Korea to talk about nuclear management together. She was a very visionary leader, just like Henry Kissinger. She believed that the United States needs to be able to see itself in a good place in the future in order to take the steps to actually get there. She would listen before she spoke, and she was a very fiscally responsible leader. She was able to balance the Stanford budget, which had been in a deficit for years. No one thought that was possible by making the hard decisions and being capable to compromise and prioritize. She earned a lot of trust by being transparent. In fact, the executive branch typically invokes executive privilege to avoid testifying before Congress, but she actually wanted to speak out on the 9/11 Commission and share her testimony, which she was allowed to do after a lot of debate, as long as it didn't set a precedent for others. And she earned a lot of trust as a leader then doing that. Her ability to compromise, to listen to other people before speaking, and taking time and effort to educate herself helped a lot of people trust her to be able to take the process of leadership and apply it in every different situation. She also had the courage to stand out and to speak hard truths and to be herself and focus on the work instead of on who she was. She was a Black woman in a lot of circles where that was not a common thing, especially in the early 2000s, and it still isn't. But she didn't let that stop her or detract her from what was required of her, just like anybody else in that role. And she also earned a lot of trust by being creative and adapting to challenges as opportunities. During the economic um, shifts of the 2000s, she coined the term right sizing as she changed embassy resources and shifted them around to be more efficient. The advent of the internet and all of its challenges that it brought helped her focus on new tools and methods of using it for e-diplomacy or virtual embassy posts. Her impacts were numerous. There's way too many to mention. She was a Soviet affairs specialist, which helped bring her into the public sphere under the Bush administration initially. And she really is known most for her idea of transformational diplomacy, basically taking diplomatic resources and putting them not where it's easiest to be a diplomat, not where it's easiest to be democratic, but placing them in areas where it's hardest, where they're actually needed the most to transform the area and help build the capacity for diplomatic reform and progress and democratic values. Um, Focusing especially on efficacy and efficiency in her embassy shifts and reform and use of the internet and basically reorganization of how embassies were organized overseas and in where people were sent. And then using that to help funnel aid to where it's actually needed to tackle resource specific issues like terrorism or the drug trade or human trafficking. Where can we use what we have to do the most good? Her nuclear powers management will always go down as in history, I think, as a very notable accomplishment. Getting all 6 parties to talk together with North Korea about nuclear management, regardless of the outcome, it's the process that matters in diplomacy, and she really embodied that. She was involved in putting forth sanctions in the UN to target Iran and its uranium enrichment, as well as working with India on a cooperative agreement, not just to punish countries who are misusing nuclear resources, but to foster their beneficial and positive use, such as the 123 agreement. She was also involved in a lot of Middle East diplomacy between Israel and Hezbollah, trying to calm down conflict in the area and make sure places were open to access for people, and also involved in a lot of talks like the Annapolis Conference of 2007, which helped to bring about discourse on the idea of a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, something that's still relevant and we're trying to accomplish today, but it can only happen if we take the space to talk about it. Here are a lot of the resources I use. She's a wonderful speaker, and a lot of interviews. I would highly encourage anyone to go listen to one or two of them. But thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.